The man they called the White Death never raised his voice. He didn't give speeches. He didn't lead charges. He didn't wear medals into battle. Most days, he walked alone into a frozen forest, wrapped in white, carrying a rifle older than some of the officers who sent him orders. He stayed still for hours, sometimes all day, in temperatures where your breath froze inside your nose. By the time the Soviets realized what was happening, more than 500 of their men would never come home. This is the story of Simo Häyhä, a quiet Finnish farmer who became the most lethal sniper in recorded history. And the symbol of a war, the Soviet Union was supposed to win easily, but nearly didn't. To understand why the Soviets feared the White Death, we have to start with a map and a mistake. The map is of Northern Europe in the late 1930s. On it, the Soviet Union stretches like a continent. To its northwest, almost invisible, is a narrow strip of land, scattered with forests and lakes: Finland. The mistake belonged to one man, Joseph Stalin. By 1939, Stalin had purged his own Red Army, executing or imprisoning tens of thousands of officers. The Soviet High Command was crippled, terrified, and obedient. Europe watched uneasily as Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression agreement with a secret clause. Eastern Europe would be divided like a pie. Poland, the Baltics, and in Stalin's mind, Finland. On paper, it was simple. The Soviet Union had more than 170 million people. Finland had about 3.7 million. The Red Army boasted thousands of tanks and aircraft. Finland had a handful by comparison. Some Soviet planners predicted the Finnish army would break in a matter of days. But wars are not fought on paper. They are fought in mud, ice, and fear. And in that frozen crucible, Simo Häyhä would become a ghost the Soviets could not kill. Before he was the White Death, Simo was just Simo. He was born in 1905 in Rautjärvi, a small rural community in southeastern Finland near the Russian border. His family were farmers, working the land through long summers and brutal winters. Finland, then, was in transition, a land with one foot in the 19th century, one in the 20th. It had been part of the Russian Empire until 1917, when the chaos of the Bolshevik Revolution allowed Finland to declare independence. That independence did not come without blood. In 1918, the country was torn apart by a brutal civil war between the socialist Reds and the conservative Whites. The Whites, backed quietly by Germany, won. The trauma of that conflict would haunt Finland for decades. Simo was too young to fight in the Civil War, but he grew up in its shadow, a world where independence felt fragile, where neighbors remembered which side you had been on. He was short, around 1.6 meters or 5 feet 3 inches, quiet, unassuming. He spent his youth doing what many Finnish boys of the countryside did, working, hunting, skiing. It was the hunting that mattered most. He learned the terrain, the way snow muffles sound, how breath shows in frozen air. He learned patience, how to wait for a shot until the animal stepped exactly where he needed it to. In his early 20s, Simo joined the Finnish Civil Guard, a kind of volunteer paramilitary organization. There, his calm demeanor and near-obsessive focus with a rifle set him apart. At 150 meters, about the length of a city block and a half, he could place rifle shots into a target the size of a coin, over and over. In winter, in summer, with iron sights, no scope. To many, he was just a reserved young man who liked to shoot. To his instructors, he was something else, an asset. They gave him a standard Finnish infantry rifle, the Mosin-Nagant M28-30. Heavy, reliable, accurate, a design adapted from an old Russian model, but refined for Finnish use. In his hands, it became an extension of his will. But no one, not even Simo, could know how important that combination, man, rifle, and winter, was about to become. In Moscow, Stalin didn't care about one Finnish farmer. He cared about Leningrad. His second city, his symbolic gateway to the world, sat dangerously close to the Finnish border, roughly 32 kilometers in some areas. In a future war with Germany, he feared, enemy artillery could be brought to bear from Finnish soil. So the Soviets made demands: move the border west, cede territory, allow Soviet military bases on Finnish land. From the Soviet perspective, this was security. From the Finnish perspective, it was survival. Finland had already learned what it meant to live next to a great empire. To give up land now, especially the Karelian Isthmus, one of its most developed regions, felt like the first cut in a slow carving away of their independence. Negotiations failed. The Soviet Union began to prepare. On the 30th of November, 1939, without a formal declaration of war, the Red Army rolled across the border. Soviet bombers struck Helsinki and other Finnish cities. The Winter War had begun. To the world, it looked like a mismatch bordering on cruelty. The Soviets had roughly 1 million men available for the Finnish front. Thousands of tanks, aircraft, arty. Finland fielded about 300,000 troops in total, with almost no armor and a tiny air force, a few dozen modern fighters. Yet the man in the Kremlin had one crucial blind spot. He underestimated the winter and the people who called it home. On the Karelian Isthmus, along the Mannerheim line, Finnish troops dug in with what little they had. The fortified line, named after Field Marshal Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim, was less a single wall and more a series of strong points, trenches, and obstacles that used the terrain itself as a weapon. Beyond that main front, in the vast forests of Karelia and along Finland's eastern border, the terrain was different, a maze of trees, swamps, and frozen lakes. Few roads, fewer villages. Here, the war was intimate. Here is where Simo Häyhä went to work. He was assigned to the 6th Company of Infantry Regiment 34, fighting along the Kollaa River, a quiet stretch of wilderness that would soon gain a grim reputation. Kollaa was not a city, it was not a fortress. It was a line on a map surrounded by snow and trees. Yet historians would later say Kollaa holds, Kollaa kestää, became a phrase that symbolized Finland's entire resistance. When Simo arrived, the snow lay deep, the air razor-sharp in the lungs. The sun barely skimmed the horizon for a few hours a day before plunging everything back into twilight. This was his element. Most modern ideas of a sniper involve high-tech optics, camouflage nets, spotters, and radios. Simo had none of those. He chose to leave his scope behind. Here's why. Telescopic scopes at the time had two major drawbacks. They sat higher on the rifle, meaning the shooter had to raise their head, exposing a larger part of their body. And, in extreme cold, the lenses could fog, freeze, or catch the reflection of sunlight, a tiny flash that might give away a position. Simo preferred simplicity. He used the standard iron sights on his M28-30. Every day he went out in his white camouflage, plain, often homemade, blending perfectly into the Finnish snow, and found a space where he could see, but from which he was difficult to see. He would pack the snow in front of him so that the muzzle blast of his rifle wouldn't kick up powder, revealing his position. He would sometimes put snow in his mouth, cooling his breath so it wouldn't steam into the air. He lay still, he waited, and then he started shooting. The Soviet infantry at Kollaa were not prepared for this. Many of them came from warmer parts of the USSR. Some were poorly trained conscripts, rushed into service by leadership that believed sheer numbers and equipment would overwhelm any resistance. They wore dark uniforms that stood out like ink against the snow. They advanced along forest roads into open spaces in large concentrations. Every advance needed reconnaissance. Every scouting patrol had to cross open ground at some point. That's when the terror began. Men would fall with no sound but the crack of a single rifle. They hadn't seen muzzle flash. They hadn't seen movement. Just one moment alive, the next gone. Rumors spread quickly in the low morale of the Soviet ranks. There was a Finnish ghost in the forest, they said. Invisible. Unkillable. The Finns had a nickname for him, Taika Ampuja, the magic shooter. The Soviets gave him one that would echo through history, Belaya Smert, the White Death. With each day, each shot, the legend grew. But behind the legend was a human being. Simo kept a tally of his confirmed kills the old-fashioned way. Marks in his memory, then confirmed by officers and comrades when possible. Within about 100 days of frontline duty, from December 1939 to early March 1940, his official count reached 505 Soviet soldiers killed by sniper fire. That does not include the additional estimated 200 or so enemy soldiers he killed with a submachine gun in close combat. Nor does it include those who may have died unobserved, unconfirmed, in the chaos of battle. Numbers like that are hard for the human mind to grasp. 505, each one a person with a name, a family, a history. And on the other side, a single man pressing a trigger. Did he feel anything? By all accounts, Simo was not cruel. He was not boastful. In the rare interviews he gave later in life, he spoke about his wartime actions with a sort of flat practicality. He said, "I did what I was told to do, as well as I could." And war is not a pleasant business, but someone has to do it. There is an uncomfortable truth here, one that often surfaces in stories of elite soldiers. What made him extraordinary was his ability to detach, to treat this deadly work like any other difficult job. For Finland, which was fighting for its very existence, men like him were not monsters. They were necessary. For the soldiers on the receiving end, he was something else entirely. A nightmare that turned any open stretch of white into a potential grave. The conditions that winter amplified his effectiveness. Temperatures on the front sometimes plunged below -30 or even -40 degrees Celsius. Metal froze. Oil thickened. Men who huddled too close to fires risked being spotted. Those who stayed too far away risked frostbite. The Soviets struggled. Their equipment, their tactics, their expectations, most of it had been built around the idea of conventional large-unit warfare. Heavy tanks, massed artillery, infantry waves. In the forest, those advantages turned clumsy. Tanks bogged in snow and forest paths. Supply lines became vulnerable. Units got lost. The Finns, smaller in number, had built their strategy around exactly those weaknesses. They used Motti tactics, cutting Soviet units into isolated pockets, like logs chopped for firewood, then destroying each one separately. Ski troops glided silently through woods, outflanking columns, hitting supply convoys. And in quiet sectors like Kollaa, snipers multiplied the pressure. Stalin's officers soon realized that their troops were being held up not just by units, but by individuals. They began to take counter-sniper measures. Artillery barrages on suspected firing positions, sharpshooters sent to hunt the hunters. Simo adjusted. He moved often. He varied his positions. He took extreme care with concealment, sometimes building snow walls or using natural cover to disappear into the landscape. But the more the Soviets tried to stop him, the more they fed the myth. The White Death is watching, some soldiers whispered. And when men believe they are being watched by death itself, fear does as much damage as any bullet. By January 1940, the wider war was turning into something the Soviets had not planned for. Internationally, the invasion of Finland damaged Soviet prestige. The League of Nations expelled the USSR volunteers, and aid flowed to Finland from across the world. Not enough to change the balance decisively, but enough to send a message. On the battlefield, Soviet casualties skyrocketed. Estimates vary, but roughly 126,000 Soviet soldiers were killed, and another 250,000 wounded or missing in just over 3 months of fighting. The Finns, for all their bravery, paid a heavy price as well. About 25,000 dead and 44,000 wounded. But proportionally, it was clear who was bleeding more. In the forests of Kollaa, Simo continued his lonely work. He woke before dawn. He moved into position, sometimes crawling for hours. He lay still until his limbs went numb, scanning, waiting. He used his rifle at ranges that made others uncomfortable. A silent professional in a landscape that seemed almost designed to shelter him. His success made him a target not just for Soviet bullets, but for propaganda. Finnish newspapers ran stories about the incredible sniper at Kollaa. His kill count was reported and updated. His anonymity, no photographs, no interviews, only deepened the mystique. The Soviets, too, started to take it personally. Artillery shells pounded Finnish positions with growing intensity. The Red Army sent its own snipers, some of them highly trained, to find and neutralize the White Death. More than once, Simo narrowly avoided being killed in these duels. In one such encounter, he noticed the faint outline of a Soviet sniper's position. A slight difference in the snow, a patch where frost had melted differently. He fired first. The enemy sniper never did. Yet, if this sounds like an almost mythic cat-and-mouse game, we need to remember what lay beneath every shot. A man alone, freezing, exhausted, knowing that to move carelessly was to die. Even legends get tired. By February 1940, the war was reaching its peak intensity. Stalin, embarrassed by the Red Army's early failures, had reorganized the offensive. Brutal new assaults crashed into the Finnish lines. On the Karelian Isthmus, Soviet troops finally began to break through sections of the Mannerheim Line. The Finnish government knew it couldn't hold out forever. Ammunition was running low. The tiny air force was stretched thin. Reserves were finite. Yet every day that Finland held on had consequences far beyond its borders. In Berlin, in the offices of the German High Command, military planners studied the Winter War. What they saw shocked them. The Red Army, this supposed giant, was bungling operations against a vastly inferior foe. To Adolf Hitler, this was a tempting signal. The Soviet Union, he thought, was a colossus with feet of clay. 2 years later, that perception would help lead him to launch Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history. Simo Häyhä didn't know any of this. His world was a few hundred meters of snow and trees. On March 6, 1940, just days before the war would end, his war came to an abrupt and violent halt. The battle that day was intense. Soviet forces were pressing hard around Kollaa, trying to crack this stubborn section of the Finnish line once and for all. Somewhere in that chaos, Simo moved into another firing position, one of countless he'd used over the past 3 months. Witnesses later said that he had already been extraordinarily effective that morning, hitting multiple targets at medium range. But this time, fate, or probability, caught up with him. A Soviet soldier fired an explosive bullet, a type of ammunition designed to detonate on impact. It struck Simo in the lower left jaw. The effect was devastating. The bullet shattered teeth, bone, and flesh. His comrades later recalled that the entire lower part of his face seemed to disappear. One of them said he could see part of Simo's face hanging loosely, nearly unrecognizable. He was dragged, unconscious, from the field, bleeding heavily. barely alive. Doctors in a field hospital took one look and likely assumed he would die. They bandaged what they could. His body, remarkably tough from a lifetime of hard physical work, clung on. He would not wake up the next day or the day after. Instead, he lay in a coma for days, as Finland's fate was decided without him. On March 12th, the Soviet Union and Finland signed the Moscow Peace Treaty. The Winter War was over. Finland ceded large areas of territory, mostly in Karelia, about 11% of its land and 30% of its economic assets. Roughly 400,000 Finns became refugees in their own country, forced to abandon homes their families had lived in for generations. But Finland remained independent. The next day, March 13th, 1940, Simo Häyhä opened his eyes. The war he had fought nearly every day for 100 brutal winter days was already history. The man in the hospital bed did not look like the fearsome White Death of Soviet rumor. His face was destroyed. Surgeons would eventually rebuild his jaw using bone grafts and reconstructive techniques that were advanced for the time, but he was left permanently disfigured. He had trouble speaking. Eating was painful. For months, he endured surgeries and recovery, slowly relearning basic functions. For his service, he was promoted from corporal directly to second lieutenant, a huge jump for someone of his background. He received decorations, congratulations, quiet visits from officers who had seen his impact at the front. Someone asked him, years later, "How did you become such a good shooter?" His answer was as blunt and unsentimental as his reputation. Practice. The war that had almost killed him did not end his time in uniform. When the Continuation War began in 1941, Finland's second, more controversial conflict alongside Nazi Germany against the Soviet Union, Simo returned to serve, though not in the same frontline sniper role. He trained others, passed on skills, but he never again became the same near-mythical presence in the snow. In some ways, his story after 1940 is defined by what did not happen. He didn't write a memoir. He didn't tour the world as a celebrity veteran. He didn't seek the limelight. Instead, when the wars finally ended, he went back to what he knew best, the countryside. He became a farmer and a hunter again, living a quiet life in rural Finland. He bred dogs. He went on moose hunts. He sometimes visited military shooting ranges where younger marksmen regarded him with awe. On one of those occasions, a fellow hunter asked him whether he regretted what he had done, all those lives taken. Simo considered the question, then reportedly replied, "I only did my duty. I did what I was told and as well as I could." It is a statement that has divided commentators ever since. Was this the voice of a man suppressing trauma? Of someone shaped by a harsh age who could not afford to dwell on moral ambiguity? Or simply of a soldier who believed that in a war of survival, such questions had no place? We cannot know his inner world. We only know what he chose to share and what others made of him. Because while Simo tried to simply be a man again, his legend refused to die. For the Soviets, the Winter War had been a humiliation wrapped inside a victory. Yes, they had gained territory, but they had paid a staggering price, revealed deep weaknesses, and earned global condemnation. Within the Soviet military, the conflict became a case study in never again. Tactics were revised, training improved. Some historians argue that these painful lessons, learned partly at Finland's expense, helped the Red Army survive the German invasion in 1941. Yet, among the soldiers who had been there, certain memories were harder to revise. In oral histories and letters, Soviet veterans recalled the terror of moving through silent forests, knowing that a single invisible man could end their lives without warning. Some truly believed that the White Death was more than one person. that it was a code name for multiple elite Finnish snipers, or even a propaganda creation. The reality that a single quiet farmer had done that much damage was almost worse. In Finland, especially after the war, Simo's story occupied an uneasy space. On one hand, he was a hero, the embodiment of a small nation's stubborn resistance, of the idea that skill and will can balance numbers and machines. On the other hand, there was the body count. 505 confirmed kills is not easily romanticized if you look at it directly. For decades, Finns spoke little about the war. It had been costly. The continuation war, with its alliance of convenience with Nazi Germany, further complicated the national narrative. But gradually, as the 20th century wound down, people began to ask more questions. Old veterans, now in their 70s and 80s, were interviewed. Among them was Simo. What struck many who met him was his ordinariness. He seemed like a grandfather, soft-spoken, with a face that bore the scars of a world gone by. He cracked dry jokes, spoke fondly of dogs and hunting trips. The man and the myth sat side by side, and he did not seem particularly interested in reconciling them. There's a deeper question here. Why do we tell stories like this? Why does one sniper in one short, brutal war loom so large in our collective imagination? Part of the answer lies in contrast. The Winter War was a clash between quantity and quality, between a sprawling authoritarian empire and a tiny democratic republic. In that frame, Simo becomes a symbol, the little guy with a rifle standing up to the giant. His individual numbers, those 505 confirmed kills, also offer something that many vast impersonal wars lack: a focal point. When we say 126,000 Soviet dead, our minds flatten the tragedy. When we say one man killed 505 of them, our brains suddenly insist on a story. Then there's the setting: the snow, the white camouflage, the silence of the forests. It has all the elements of a dark fairy tale, the ghost in the woods, unseen until it's too late. But there's another side to it. Simo Häyhä's story forces us to confront the brutal efficiency that humans can achieve in killing one another, not as monsters, but as skilled professionals. It's uncomfortable precisely because he is not portrayed as a sadist or fanatic. He was, by his own account, a man who did his job well. The Soviets feared the White Death not only because he killed many of their soldiers, but because he represented something they could not easily mass-produce: intimate knowledge of the land, matched with exceptional individual skill and absolute focus. No tank column could substitute for that. No artillery barrage could guarantee his death. In the end, what finally silenced his rifle was not Soviet tactics, but random chance in a chaotic firefight. And perhaps that's the oldest lesson of war. No matter how much planning, how much training, how much myth-making, chaos and luck still decide who lives and who dies. Simo Häyhä died on April 1st, 2002, at the age of 96. He lived long enough to see his country transformed, from a poor, war-scarred frontier nation to a modern, prosperous state. Long enough to see the Soviet Union, the giant that had once threatened to erase Finland, collapse into history. In his final years, he gave a few interviews. He remained consistent. I did what I was told as well as I could. When asked how he had managed to survive so many days at the front as a visible target, he shrugged off any notion of destiny. The important thing, he said, is to aim well. Today, his rifle is displayed in a Finnish museum. His story is told in documentaries, books, and countless online videos and articles. In some of them, he is elevated almost to superhuman status. In others, he is dissected as a case study in the psychology of killing. The truth sits somewhere in between. He was not a superhero. He was not a monster. He was a product of his time, his land, and his choices. A man whose extraordinary skill collided with an extraordinary moment in history. For the Soviet soldiers who advanced through those winter forests in 1939 and 1940, the White Death was a symbol of everything terrifying about this strange, stubborn enemy. Invisible, stubborn, and utterly at home in the cold. For Finland, he is part of a larger memory, of a winter when a small nation stood, rifle in hand, in front of a storm and refused to move. The echoes of that winter still shape Northern Europe today, in borders, in politics, in the collective memory of what it means to be small beside a giant. And somewhere in those echoes, if you listen closely, you can hear a single rifle shot, cracking once across a frozen field, then disappearing into the silence. If you'd like to explore more stories like this, of individuals who became symbols, and small nations that changed the course of great powers, consider subscribing to the channel. History is full of quiet people who did extraordinary things when the world caught fire. Let's keep uncovering their stories together.